Download the AllStar app. Make your picks for UFC fights, challenge your friends, level up and win prizes. Link in description. Get it now.
Well, Errol Hawani has reported that the sale of Bellator is imminent, and it looks like PFL is going to end up buying Bellator. And we saw recently that PFL just got a huge investment, right, of $100 million from the Saudi Arabia. I forgot what company, what country it is. Saudi Arabia, I believe, right? Yeah. So tell us what that means. First, the $100 million investment, or whatever amount investment, and then is the sale imminent? Let's go into that. We'll let you speak a little bit, and then we can feed off what you say.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, in terms of, right, like there's been a lot of rumors around the sale. There's been different reporting. Now it seems that it's imminent, right? The Kawani's usually on top of that. It's when will they announce it? What's, the deal there? But the Saudi investment, basically Saudi Arabia and Qatar are fighting each other to become the next economic hub and trying to make their respective countries the economic hub in the Middle East, right? Like that's part of the Qatar World Cup. That's part of Saudi Arabia giving money to WWE and Live Golf, right? And like Saudi Arabia has bought a bunch of soccer teams, like where they've bought like well-known soccer teams and taken a lot of prospect players and moved them there. Obviously, Cristiano Ronaldo is the huge signing. That was like $800 million or something crazy to go play in Saudi Arabia. Dude. Some unreal amount of money. But so they have these funds that are basically money that's earmarked specifically for investing or like helping to grow sports. And so it comes from a $650 billion or $1 million fund, like some ungodly amount of money fund. Then they have this fund, the SRJ, which is called Surge. That's how you're supposed to pronounce it. And through that fund, it was announced not that long ago, like a couple of weeks ago, a month ago, whenever they made the announcement that PFL was getting the money, because PFL was their first investment in $100 million. And what that's signaling is they're trying to get into the MMA game similarly to how they did with Live Golf, how they have with soccer, right? This is an opportunity they see of, okay, if we throw enough money here, right? They now have Francis Ngannou. They're talking about bringing other fighters on. Jake Paul is under the banner, Clarissa Shields, right? Like this is enough money we're going to try and throw at this to, bring events to Saudi Arabia, help sports wash, right? If that's what you want to call it from a political standpoint of the human rights violation stuff. This is a way to kind of help their image. It's good PR for them. This is what they're trying to do. And they've been trying to do it for a while in different sports. MMA is just its most recent target. In terms of the deal with Bellator, the interesting thing to me is going to be PFL has basically staked their entire company off of being a different business model where it's a tournament. It's all meritocratic, right? Based on the season and playoff rules. I mean, I say that, right? Natan Levy's, or at home, or not Natan Levy, Natan Schultz is at home, cursing right now, rightfully so. But I mean, that's their gimmick, is like their differentiation, right? If you're talking about strategic, competitive strategy, their differentiation is their model that they're using, tournament only format and all this. If you buy Bellator, you get a bunch of name fighters outside of the UFC, which is great, but you're going to have a much more bloated roster now, right? And the question is, Bellator has done a lot of tournaments too. Like, how do you get that together? They've already kind of hinted at what they're doing with the Saudi money, where they're starting a MENA region PFL league, similar to what they've done with PFL Europe, and they want to do a world tournament, which I think is an interesting idea. It's a good gimmick where, okay, you're going to have everybody fight through their own like countries or global positioning tournament, and then have everybody come together for a world championship tournament. Great. Makes sense. I don't know if you add Bellator fighters into those different tournaments. I don't know if you have Bellator be its own separate tournament and then the winner of that gets to be thrown in the World Championships too. I'm just not sure how they're going to integrate Bellator into the PFL model, because whenever you have a merger and acquisition, right? Like, it's a complicated process. You're going to have duplicate jobs. People are going to lose their jobs, front office people. Fighters are going to get cut because they're just going to have to get cut. And once you eliminate those redundancies, you have this brand new company and you kind of see where it goes. I have no idea how PFL plans to use Bellator outside of taking their biggest name fighters and inserting them into the tournaments. Like, that makes plenty of sense. But it's an interesting call because by absorbing Bellator, right, they become the de facto number 2 promotion. And Don Davis has said, like, they're trying to actually become a co-leader in this. I don't know that it actually helps in that regard. It's step 1 in getting more, like, every fighter not under UFC contract that's a bigger name outside of the one championship guys now. Everybody's under one umbrella. That's great, but there's still so many other hurdles and things in the way. It doesn't just equate, like, stock dropped. Endeavor and WWE stock plummeted after this happened because everybody's like, oh, it's Live Golf. It's not Live Golf. Until the antitrust lawsuit is done and some major changes are made to UFC contracts, I don't think this does much at all, because you can't go get an Israel Adesanya. You can't go get a Conor McGregor, even if you want to, because they're under 8-fight, 9-fight deals, right? Like, it's not a coincidence that all of the champions before their most recent title defenses, you hear Jorge Masvidal signed a 7-fight deal with the UFC. McGregor, before, when he came back, 8-fight deal with the UFC. There's a reason they've done that. They've locked those guys down. Until that changes, UFC's brand power is too strong. I don't think PFL Bellator is able to challenge it, but it is the biggest threat to the UFC. I will say this, since Pride and Strikeforce. Pride was a bigger threat than at the time, but since Strikeforce,
that's where they bought him. That's where they bought him. That's why they bought him, because at that time, during that era, you could do that. The UFC could go over there and buy them. Now it'd be much harder, right? With all the attention that they have, with all the lawsuits and everything that's going on right now, it's much, much harder for them. But focusing on, like, Bellator and PFL, J-Spec, as a spectator, you've been watching PFL more than probably all 3 of us, or at least 2 of us right here that are on the show. Like, what would the impact be if Bellator roster was infused into the PFL and they just ran the same thing next year with the PFL roster? With the PFL Bellator roster infused.
Gotcha. So, going back to the start of this, the initial reaction from fans, because I've brought up this conversation quite a bit, because I was actually looking forward to this. I'll explain that in just a minute, but, like, this could be, like Pat just said, the most significant threat, most significant fusion in MMA's history, because we have 2 legitimate companies that are sought as, and you can get into a debate about it, but everybody ranks PFL, 2 or 3, or Bellator 2 or 3. So either way, they're 2 or 3 on everybody's list, and you're fusing 2 and 3 together. I just think that will have a definite spike in interest into the PFL, just because now the names, it's like you said, it's everybody that's recognizable that's not there. The question part is, how many people get left over? I first heard about this possible merger thankfully from Chris Brennan, whose son, Lucas Brennan, fights in Bellator, and he, kind of broke it a little early. And he said, well, for my son, I think we're okay because he's undefeated and he's ranked. Probably the top 25% of the roster from Bellator gets absorbed, and everybody else, maybe the top 50%, but the top 25% and everybody else gets cut. The reality is, if you took the top 50% or the top 25% of both rosters and you really did write all the names down, dude, that's a solid list of people. It is. It's a super solid list of people, man. So I think you start crossing once you get that together. I know PFL is struggling to get onto the whole pay-per-view model, and that's always where every fighting brand has to be. But with all of that coming together, because that was the other question around PFL that I get asked all the time. How the hell are they going to have pay-per-views, man? They only got Francis. How is that going to work? Well, I think it kind of works now that you got all this other stuff. Last but not least, PFL, like the UFC, probably is looking at, hey, ESPN, how much they want from you guys, how much they want to juice you for all that MMA content. We can make a whole bunch of MMA content. I bet you for a little bit cheaper. And with that being said, now you could have a bigger thing going on where now I know it's a long answer, but I've talked to a lot of people on how could this work. This could work beautifully. You could have the problem with Bellator, right? And the problem with PFL that people feel is they're just not on enough. The people love the PFL format. They love the season, but when the season dries up or the gaps in between, you know, the weight classes in the regular season format, it kills the draw. People like Bellator, not as much as PFL, I think, but they hate, and even the fighters for them, they hate how few fights they put on. They're on one like once a month. I think you can actually solve all of these problems. Like this merger.
You're saying we want more fights?
Yeah, they want more. Yeah, they want more fights because they don't get to be seen as often. People don't recognize Bellator fighters because they're not on. UFC is on every single week. Even the junk people the junk cards that people complain about, they get to be seen all the time. So now, if you had PFL and Bellator fighters fused together, fighting a little bit more frequently, creating a natural top 8 where that playoff Grand Prix format can really shine, man, you got a lot of elements, dude. And I really, really, really like, and people have really been receptive to the concept of a world championship, having those the Europe, Africa, wherever else they might earmark as a, you know, whatever. If it's all continents, let's just guess it's all continents. And a real world championship for the first time in MMA, holy shit. But who knows? I don't know if you can buy that with $100 million.
It's a great concept and it's sexy and all, but it will never happen. There's no... You're going to run tournaments in different parts of the world and you expect that to be perfect? Your regular season was filled with grenades and landmines and explosions.
But those are the lower tier guys. Like those regional ones, they only give the winner of that like $100K.
No, I'm saying like running the system. It's not about the money. It's not about. It's about running the system. They can't even run the system properly in America. How can they run the system around the world?
Rob Wilkinson, right? Like popped. It got pulled from the tournament. The former,
yeah. Obviously, that was ugly. But look, they immediately jumped to the best answer they could find. USADA. I hate USADA, but from a public standpoint, isn't that the best answer you could throw at that problem?
Yes. So here's the one thing I will say, and this is always true in business, especially, you know, as someone that does consulting for startups, right? Like, it's the perception, right? Like, we know the reality. We pay attention. You know, John, you and I have watched PFL shows. We know what the ratings are like. We know the God, what was it? PFL season 3 of the playoffs was like 8 hours, and there was just nothing. Wow. Like it was terrible. But when you're going to sell to an investor, aka, you know, Surge or anyone else, because right, you've got Kevin Hart, you've got all your friends investing together, blah, blah, blah. There are a ridiculous amount of investors who know nothing, have a ton of money from whatever reason because they made money either, you know, talk about Surge, we're talking about you know, The Rock, who's invested in this, right? Like what have you. And they know nothing about it. They hear a pitch from their friend, like, hey, hear this pitch. And then you have an hour or you bring them to a show and you're like, hey, like, here's my chance to sell you on this. And merger and acquisition sounds great. Like, it doesn't matter that like it's going to have all the problems and all this other stuff. If you're going out and you're telling people like, hey, we bought what was the number 2 de facto MMA promotion, like that's how much we're growing. We also got 20 different sponsors, right? Like they listed out Budweiser, Bose, a whole bunch of other things. That helps you go to more vendors and say like, look, we've got all these guys, we're growing, we're booming. You want to get in on this, and you sell them on the FOMO. The amount of investors and I know who have thrown money at awful ideas just because someone could sell it correctly and had just the right stuff to back it up is insane. I mean, that's like there are so many companies. There's another MMA promotion we both might know where I've seen that happen, and it's ridiculous. But yeah, it's crazy. And so I'm not. The one thing I will say is this will make a big splash, and it will be good for marketing, and it will help a lot. I don't know how it actually works behind the scenes, but JSpec has a point there. It will look good, and perception is like 90% of this stuff half the time.
Well, with this, of course, you want to see competitors. You do want to see competitors. Merging is a good idea for many different reasons, but being separate is also a good thing for fighters because it gives you more options, and free agency is more prevalent. But if you take away one promotion, free agency, there's less options for the major fighters, right? There's less options for the highest level fighters. But the money thing is so interesting because, like you said, Live Golf and these guys are going in there and buying soccer teams and throwing like 800, 900. That's crazy amounts of money, dude. That's like nearing $1 billion for an athlete, right? And could they do that? Like you said, there's contracts with the UFC and all of that stuff, and there are a lot of fighters are signing 8-fight contracts. But can they go steal these guys away that are not in 8-fight contracts? They're like 2 fights left? They just fight out their contracts because they know that win or lose, Live, whatever you want to call it, PFL, they're telling them behind the scenes. I know it's illegal and everything, but behind the scenes, they're telling these guys, yo, get out of here, like fight your contract out and we'll sign you for this amount of money. And it's much more than what you're getting paid by the UFC. Could that be something that is being played?
Absolutely. And I don't have the business smarts that Mr. Pat has, but I'll tell you this. The Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and all them, they're putting money in all kinds of sport and sport adjacent stuff. There's all kinds of economic stuff that goes into this answer, but I'm not going to waste my time jabbering about that. The point is, they got shit tons of money, a shit ton of money. Like this is just a little sprinkle they threw on it just to see like if there's any nibbles. If they want to make a move, if they really want to make a move on MMA, they got enough money to buy everybody.
I think it's one of those things where the best example I can come up with for an analogy is what's going on in pro wrestling right now, right? Which is AEW is challenging WWE, and I don't know if you guys follow pro wrestling at all, but like essentially, like in that scenario, you have the owner, a billionaire owner of the Jacksonville Jaguars' son, being payrolled to like create a competitor for WWE. And that's a little bit different because the contracts aren't as restrictive and there are like more outs. So you've got stars going back and forth. But I think that is a prime example where the money and what you have in the bank is great. But you got to remember that like the UFC brand image, even if Liv can pull this off or Liv equivalent really, right? Like you pull off what Liv did with Surge. Like even if PFL can pull this off, it will take a long, long time to erode that brand power. I mean, you've got 65% of the Contender Series guys being signed, and it's probably going to be higher this season. And they're backfilling people and letting go of more to then go to the PFL or go to Bellator or go wherever to help cut down in costs. And their ticket prices and gates and their viewership is still just incredible. UFC is killing it. And so the contract thing is the biggest issue because the UFC will also, and in their contracts right now, which you'd have to get a judge to strike this down, besides it being just crazy restrictive and all the things they can do to extend it, right? Like take a look at Francis Ngannou. They knew Francis was probably leaving. They tried to schedule something for him when they knew his visa was going to expire and extended it out. Like they've got all those little tricks. But beyond all that, they have a matching rights period. And if the UFC at any point thought like, hey, we are actually like in trouble here in terms of somebody offering a ton of money and taking a star, like Surge isn't just going to throw like Ronaldo money at this because it's not, at that level, but they could match an offer, which would force PFL to invest a ton in one fighter or a couple fighters. And that's something that, I'm not even sure would work. Even Live Golf, right? Like they got a bunch of people to leave the PGA Tour to go over there, and now eventually they're merging. But PGA was still, if you follow golf, PGA was the tour. UFC is still going to be the brand, and they're going to have a bunch of fighters that are going to see some number from the UFC and be like, man, I don't even need any extra money. I'm going to take this amount of money the UFC is giving me, which is more than they would have gotten before. And I'm fighting for the best promotion in the world, the recognizable promotion, the platform. And they're going to lock up the main guys. And it's going to be very hard for Surge and PFL to truly erode at that. It's going to take decades, I think, honestly, unless the antitrust lawsuit changes things. If they limit contracts, all bets are off. But otherwise, I mean, it's the brand power is too strong.
The next few years are going to be very, very interesting, especially pertaining to like contracts and lawsuits and all, like behind the scenes stuff. It's going to be interesting because it will impact the fighters tremendously. Yeah. What results?
The next 6 months are going to be huge if the appeals court does, because they've set a trial date for the lawsuit. They've fast tracked it finally. So if the appeals court doesn't pick up the UFC stuff for whatever reason, that trial starts April, I think, 1st or April 2nd. Like that's humongous if they would have to go to trial or settle. I mean, I think the appeals court will pick it up. It'll be a whole thing. But either way, it's going to be, the next 12 months are crucial for many pieces. If boxing has had this problem before, and what they did was they canceled basically contract lengths so that anybody could, like, you immediately were free from any contract restrictions. If the UFC got that injunctive relief put on them by the plaintiffs in the antitrust lawsuit, could you imagine if we wake up one day and suddenly all fighters are able to go wherever they want? Yeah. Then you've got chaos for days.
That's called independent contractor.
Yes, that's what it should be. But yeah, I mean, it's going to be crazy. But without the UFC antitrust lawsuit, I guess my point is this goes nowhere fast. It doesn't matter how much money you throw at it, whatever. You'll get an Ngannou, you'll get 1 or 2 big stars. But it's the casual fan who doesn't watch anything except for the occasional big UFC fight because, they've heard of it, whatever, not going to affect them, right? Like, I don't see that being the case.
I got a question. Obviously, we're talking about the implications of the antitrust lawsuit, but what about, I lost track of this story, so I don't know if you guys know the progress or if there's any on they call it the Muhammad Ali Act Part 2, the extension. Is there any further progress with that? Because that could that possibly shake loose?
No, that would do the same thing, and they've been talking about bringing it back, but politics kind of shut it down, and then the rep who introduced it has not brought it to the floor yet. It's just politics.
Gotcha.
Well, I was talking to a coach, and he was telling me about some what do you call them? Proposals to government about that, exactly, about like health insurance for fighters. Like, it's going to Washington D.C., right? Like, this is what I heard from a coach. Like, they're like pushing for that.
It's ready to be introduced to like the actual Senate or House floor, but the main thing is, and I don't want to dive too far into politics here, but like, it was going well until Trump was elected. Well, I mean, lobbyists, but then Trump was elected and Trump is friends with Dana White, right?
Oh, yeah.
And so, like, then suddenly it just gets put on the shelf for 4 years. And now you've got another election coming up where, Trump may be the Republican nominee again. And and so like, my guess is it would be the end of next year after the election, like if when all the other batshit crazy things happening in politics with Trump, like until he's completely out of politics or he's like not going to be a factor, I don't think it gets introduced because there's that's a very complex.
American stupid fucking politics. We can skip that part.
We can skip that.
So basically, Dana White's going to be pushing for Trump hard when this election comes up. Guarantee he's going to be doing some speeches or something somewhere, right? Just to pay his bills. Basically,
he never brought any other former president cage side Like
Yeah.
he's the only one.
Well, he's not buddies with them, right? I think he's known Trump for a while, so you know
I'm
what I
just saying, like in
Trump-
general,
Trump-
right? Like it's the
Trump
president.
was a huge proponent of the UFC, like hosting the UFC
Back in the
back
day,
in
yeah.
early.
Oh yeah,
like,
yeah.
I mean,
Back in his
yeah.
old hotels, back in the day, yeah.
So they
Yeah,
got
so-
roots, man. Roots are roots. They hold tighter than anything, man. These guys. But yeah, like the I'm excited to see what happens. You know what I mean? Do I want it to happen? To be honest, I don't really care, like if it happens or not, because you know, we're gonna watch fighting no matter what, right? It's just fighting. There's promotions all over the world, but when you look at the roster, right? Let's take it. Let's dive into this last, and we'll take off. When you look at the roster, and you rank rosters, right? Like you rank number 1 UFC. Let's say UFC is number 1. Number 2 is Bellator. Number 3 is One Championship. Where does PFL rank along the global promotions roster wise? They're probably at the bottom, right?
I mean, depends. Like, I guess it depends on like depth or tops. I mean, yeah. I mean, even I would say in terms
depth,
of recognized.
right? Yeah,
Well, I mean,
recognizable names and
recognizable names. Yes, I'd say they're near the bottom. I mean, you could argue that they're ahead of one, like depending on the region, right? And like just depending, like there's been enough especially now they brought in Anthony Pettis, they brought in Shane Burgos, like they brought in former UFC guys. You could argue now that they're at 3, maybe 2 if you're really pushing it. But like, yeah, I mean, in terms of like actual skill depth, I don't know. Like that's part of it gets real dicey. Like
it does. But then if you add the
yeah.
Bellator roster, they're clearly number 2.
Oh yeah. You
And
put Bellator and
challenging for the
PFL
number
to,
one.
yes. Yeah, you put Bellator and PFL together, they're clearly the number 2 roster. The only issue with that in terms of translating that into money is that like the UFC has talked about this. They have 8 tiers of people they target, right? From like super hardcore, watches every MMA thing, to a person that buys a fight once every like 2 years. Like they buy a McGregor fight. That's it. Like the problem is basically in tier, I think 7 and 6, right? Like that's where you start to lose anyone that's not UFC because of the brand power that they have and the marketing power that they have. And so like, on the very rare occasion, you get somebody in like 5 that might like see a notable name from the UFC, or it's a big enough hype. They're like, okay, I'll check this out. But so like, even if you combine PFL and Bellator, like, right, everybody talks about how they thought McKee beating Patricio Pitbull was like his Conor McGregor moment. He was going to be a star, whatever. Nothing happened. Like they just don't have the reach with the general casual fan. And so it helps you become number 2, but you still have to find a way to break out of that problem. Like Kayla Harrison, PFL pushed her as the woman, right? Like that's our star. But ratings never reflected that, right? Like she didn't get, like it never translated well. Like, and that's the problem. That
They wanted Ronda Rousey type of hype around it. And it just never happened.
Right. Like, yeah, it's...
And it's funny that you say that, because I think you're super right. You know, when I host the watch parties for these different events, there's a massive drop off, dude. Like everybody shows up for the UFC fights, and then it's a very small portion. And I think it's equal when I hold one or PFL or Bellator. It's just the small contingent of fans that like each. It's almost like a shared, whatever's left is shared almost equally amongst the rest of them. But when it comes to recognizing fighters, I think one does have the advantage with recognizing stars, if you will. I think they have a little bit more. When you talk about people wanting to give a shit that it's on, people actually care to see PFL because they don't have to know the roster. They don't care. They just want to see the tournament or how it's playing out. Who's making $1 million? That's the common person's question. Oh, who's fighting for $1 million? Bellator, people have kind of checked out. Unless you're a former UFC star, it's not really going in that column. So with all that being said, I think it's going to be great if there's actual, like, a rivalry happens, kind of like the vintage, since we used pro wrestling analogies earlier, when WCW finally got to rival WWE for that small period of time. It was magical for everybody. So I guess in a weird childhood reflective kind of way. I hope the same thing happens in MMA, where we have a strong number 2 that creates a healthy rivalry, and all that happens is we, the fans, get the benefits of it all.
Let's go out with this. Francis Ngannou, Jake Paul, Clarissa Shields. Those are kind of like the staples for that pay-per-view thing, that pay-per-view model that they got coming up. That's what I'm most interested about out of everything that's going on, more than the purchase, is to see what type of numbers they're able to attract on a pay-per-view competing against the UFC, right? I want to see what because they're going to try to be more open about it, right? Because they want to show that they're competing against them and saying like a competitor, not like, oh, we're just part of the category, we're just part of the sport. No, we're actually competing. So that's going to be interesting as well.